You don't want to make any promises, Mr. Kane, you don't want to keep.
These will be kept. I'll provide the people of this city with a daily paper that will tell all the news honestly.
In the minds of most people, Kane is synonymous with William Randolph Hearst. And that, of course, is no accident. He was in large measure based on William Randolph Hearst. Both are men who straddle the 19th and the 20th century. Both were newspaper publishers, and both were highly controversial. And of course, the resemblance between Charles Foster Kane and William Randolph Hearst is what gave Orson Welles and the movie itself so many problems. The screenwriter, Herman Mankiewicz, had been a longtime figure in Hollywood. He'd been around since the early 30s, touching up scripts. He was known as a wizard at being a script doctor. And he was also a very convivial party guest. He was known for it. He was witty, he was lively, and that made him a very good guest to go to San Simeon, which was William Randolph Hearst's famous castle where he presided over this great baronial banquet hall with his longtime mistress, Marion Davies. Herman Mankiewicz probably thought to himself, I can do something with this crazy menage and this, lord of the manor and his mistress and all of their guests. Then, when Mankiewicz was engaged by Orson Welles to write a script for the movie that he saw as his debut, after some conversations between the two, they agreed that Hearst was an excellent subject, better than Howard Hughes, who Welles had also contemplated writing about, better than some of the other titans of American industry, or a president, which were other ideas that they had shot back and forth. Mankiewicz holed up in Victorville, California, and banged out what was, by all accounts, an exceedingly overlong first draft of a script called American. Then it gets passed on to Welles. Now, Welles was not naive. Welles knew that if he was going to make a movie about William Randolph Hearst, he was opening himself up to a world of all different kinds of trouble. So he reads this script, which, according to Robert Carringer, hewed pretty closely to Hearst's life, much closer than the later film did. And he looked it over and he started paring out things that were a little too close to Hearst. Hearst was born into money, which was a considerable difference between him and Charles Foster Kane, who wound up getting his money almost like one might win the lottery. Hearst sort of rattled around for quite a while before he decided what he was going to do with his life. And eventually, he took control of the San Francisco Examiner, which his father had bought almost on a whim, basically for political reasons. And Hearst soon found that he had a knack for running a newspaper and that he enjoyed it. He liked the power, he liked the control, he liked being the one who called the shots on the articles and the editorials and everything else. And this kind of set the pattern for how he was going to run his entire empire as it grew and grew and grew. He entered the New York City market in 1895 with purchasing the New York Morning Journal, and from there he was more or less on his way. He became a pioneer of what they called yellow journalism, a derisive term for the type of journalism that Hearst practiced, which was, in a word, unscrupulous.
Carter, I want you to send your best man to see Mr. Silverstone in Brooklyn. Have him tell Mr. Silverstone if he doesn't produce his wife, Mrs. Silverstone, at once, the Inquirer will have him arrested.
If he didn't have the details of a murder or a political scandal, they would sometimes simply make them up. Hearst papers had a major role in prompting the U.S. to go into the Spanish-American War, and this turns up in Citizen Kane quite famously.
Girls, delightful in Cuba, stop. Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
That's fine.
As it happens, Frederick Remington, the illustrator, was in Cuba during an inactive period, and he cabled his boss, Hearst, saying there was basically nothing going on, and could he just come back? And Hearst wired him back and said, please remain. If you furnish the pictures, I will furnish the war.
There's only one man who can rid the politics of this state of the evil domination of boss Jim Geddes.
Hooray!
I am speaking of Charles Foster Kane, the fighting liberal, the friend of the working man, the next governor of this state.
So, of course, it was to be expected that a man who was wielding this amount of money, power, and influence might eventually turn his eyes towards politics, and Hearst did. He served 2 terms in the U.S. Congress as a representative. He came within 3,000 votes of winning a race for New York City mayor, but the powerful Democratic Tammany Hall machine reportedly really did do fraud at the polls, dumping some of the boxes of votes in heavily pro-Hearst precincts into the East River. After suffering that defeat, he ran for New York State governor and lost. And then he ran one more time for mayor, and he lost quite badly. He eventually abandoned his political aspirations, as does Charles Foster Kane, but for very different reasons. He simply couldn't get elected. Hearst got married in 1903 to Millicent Wilson, and together they had 5 sons. But the marriage eventually, if not soured, kind of went stale for the both of them. And Hearst had always had a taste for chorus girls. In fact, Millicent herself had been a member of the chorus when he met her. One night he went to a show and he spotted beautiful Marion Duras in the chorus and fell in love with her. They began a relationship which was to last for the rest of Hearst's life. He was determined to turn her into a star, and he also had ambitions in Hollywood. So he went out to Hollywood and began to set up shop. He established Cosmopolitan Pictures, and yes, he definitely used that as a way to advance Marion Davies' career. Although, as it happened, fortunately for him, she was a very talented actress, especially in comedy, and he eventually began to accrue a great deal of influence in Hollywood as a producer and as a money man. So as rich and as powerful as he was, Hearst was not immune to the greater forces of economics. And when the Wall Street crash happened in 1929 and the Great Depression set in, it did affect his holdings. Circulation declined, ad pages plunged, and Hearst's income began to get smaller and smaller.
Then, in the first year of the Great Depression, a Kane paper closes.
One thing that Citizen Kane really gets about Hearst is that for him, the fun and the thrill of business was in acquiring, getting, buying more and more newspapers, and then buying more and more art, buying this, buying that. This was fine when the economy was roaring, as it was in the 20s. When he was still doing this in the 1930s, things began to go south, as Hemingway said, at first gradually, and then all at once.
How much do you think all this is worth, Mr. Thompson?
Millions? Anybody wants it?
Well, at least he brought all this stuff to America.
What's that? Another Venus?
His debts became so large that he couldn't make the payments of the interest, let alone pay off anything on the principal. And people sat down with William Randolph and had a come-to-Jesus talk. and he realized he was going to have to start selling things off. He said that the magazines were off limits and most of the newspapers were off limits. He did close a few underperforming newspapers. He merged a couple of others, but basically he held on to as many as he possibly could. Those were his babies, and those were the source of his influence. He couldn't give it up. But aside from his newspaper and his magazine empire, things began to crumble. Construction on Sam Simeon, which, like Xanadu, was basically always being expanded, suddenly ceased. He started to sell off his art collection. Now, this collection was so vast that there were parts of it that they didn't even realize he owned until they began to assess it for sale. There were so many paintings, silver and objects and sculptures that they could not sell it all at once because it would have crashed the entire art market. So this was the state of the Hearst empire by 1940. And when you look back on it, you can see that it was not irrational for Herman Mankiewicz and Orson Welles to think that Hearst was, if not a paper tiger by now, at least considerably diminished in his power and in his ability to strike back. One biographer says that Hearst had taken on more of the public image of an eccentric millionaire who was sort of coasting on his past glories. This may be what the two screenwriters thought was going on. Just how wrong they were about to find out. During the 1930s, there were a number of theatrical works that parodied Hearst or outright condemned him. 5 years before he made KANE, Orson Welles was in one of them. It was a play called 10 Million Ghosts by Sidney Kingsley, and it had a recognizable Hearst character that was used to drive home the anti-fascist message of the play. In 1939, the novelist Aldous Huxley published a novel called After Many a Summer Dies the Swan. Now, this was about an enormously wealthy, eccentric publisher who has taken refuge on a hilltop mansion with his Catholic, hard-drinking blonde mistress. Now who could that possibly have been about? Yet there's no evidence that Hearst read the book, and there is certainly nothing that he ever did to Aldous Huxley, who continued to work, including in Hollywood. Now, all of these things Hearst was probably aware of, almost certainly aware of, and he reacted to none of them. He didn't denounce them. He didn't go after the playwrights or the actors or anybody else. Now, if you look back on all of this when you are about to make your movie in 1941, maybe you figure this is how Hearst deals with people who are lampooning him. Hearst's eyes and ears on the ground in Hollywood were Luella Parsons, and Welles at first really succeeded in charming her, and he was helped by the fact that she was easy to sort of mislead. He reassured her that it had nothing to do with her boss, and she believed him. And then Hedda Hopper was let into an early screening. Hedda Hopper got in touch with the Hearst people and said, "You had better take a look at this movie. It is uncomfortably close to the boss." This finally lit a fire under Luella Parsons. She demanded a screening, which she got. She went there with 2 lawyers from the Hearst Corporation, and it did not go well. As a matter of fact, reportedly, she left before the movie had completely finished. And there were gasps of horror during the screening. So Luella went back to the Hearst Corporation, and this is when things really started cooking in terms of the campaign to stop Citizen Kane from being released, or if it was released, to make sure that as few people as humanly possible knew about it or went to see it. Here is where, if you go back into newspaper archives, you will start noticing a big split between what is covered in the Hearst papers, which is virtually nothing, and what is covered in the non-Hearst papers. One thing that gets mentioned in the contemporary non-Hearst press of the time is that Hearst was morbidly afraid of death and dying. He didn't even like the word death being mentioned in his presence, according to these articles. And so a movie that begins with him dying alone and miserable, well, that would probably bother just about anybody, but it was these people's theory that it bothered him more than it would have a number of others. To be portrayed as he is in the first newsreel of Citizen Kane, and then from about the midpoint of the movie onward, as someone diminished, even rather pathetic and sad and alone and no longer feared or even respected, that would have been really hard to take, especially from an upstart 25-year-old liberal like Orson Welles. Herman Mankiewicz had put in details of the real Marion that anybody who knew her would have instantly recognized. One is the jigsaw puzzles, but that's relatively minor. But the other thing that Alexander and Davies had in common may be the one thing that hurt Hearst the most, and that was the portrayal of Susan's alcoholism.
Miss Alexander. This is Mr. Thompson, Miss Alexander.
I want another drink, John.
Marion Davies was herself an alcoholic. She was known for it in Hollywood. Hearst, like many another person in a codependent relationship, had spent years trying to cover up Marion's drinking and to compensate for it. It was one of the only things that caused conflict and fights between them. Just about the only time Marion ever threatened to leave him was when Hearst one time suggested that she take a cure for her alcohol dependency. Now imagine Hearst coming across this movie. That must have hurt. And I find it very plausible that this was one of the main, if not the main, reasons he hated the movie as much as he did. In January of 1941, you can start seeing articles come out about Hearst's anger at the movie and about what Hearst plans to do about it. And he takes a couple of tacks. At first, you start seeing these non-Hearst newspapers report on the fact that Hearst was trying to tag Orson Welles as a communist on fairly flimsy evidence. Then he seems to reconsider that. And it is reported in late January that word has gone out that Hearst is not going to be accepting any advertising for any RKO picture, which would, of course, have been disastrous. And then somewhat later in the year, you start seeing them walk that back. Apparently, it didn't last very long. But it is reported, and this is the one that stuck, that what Citizen Kane and its maker are going to get from the Hearst press is the silent treatment. No coverage. They would accept no advertising for them. Not one critic for a Hearst paper was going to review Citizen Kane. And even when they had the theater listings that just told you what was playing where, if what was playing was Citizen Kane, they did not even list the name of the movie in those columns. It was harsh, and it was actually quite effective. Then, simultaneously, while this was going on, Hearst and some of his allies in Hollywood, of which he still had quite a few, began to put pressure on exhibitors not to screen Citizen Kane. And this was, in the end, perhaps even more devastating to the movie and its first-run chances. In terms of critical reception, Citizen Kane could not have asked for better. Critic after critic declared it revolutionary, one of the best movies they had ever seen. Its bad reviews were few and very far between. It won the New York Film Critics Circle Award in the shortest meeting that body has ever had. The National Board of Review also gave it its highest accolade. People recognized the quality of Citizen Kane right away. For many years, Hearst and Marion had been the most desirable hosts in Hollywood. However, they began to withdraw from that social scene. Marion's drinking, unfortunately, worsened with their increased isolation. They retreated to a ranch in Northern California that Hearst owned, and they spent most of World War II there. And eventually, in 1951, Hearst died at the age of 88. Marion remarried shortly thereafter. As fate would have it, 1951 was around the same time that Citizen Kane was beginning to circulate among the European critics and young cinephiles who would start it back on its way to becoming a revered motion picture. But they were certainly not the only ones that saw the merit in it. I read about one particular theater in Dallas that advertised its revival of Citizen Kane in 1957 by calling it the movie that the combined efforts of Luella Parsons and Hearst could not destroy because it's one of the 5 greatest motion pictures of all time.
Declaration of Principles.
What?
Hmm?
What is it?